Welcome to my channel. Please like, subscribe and share. Imani stumbled back, her knees buckling. I didn't mean, she stammered, but Abeni's shadow's presence seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't escape. You stole everything from me, the shadow said, and now you will answer for it. The confrontation at the river left Imani shaken. She returned to her hut, her mind racing. The shadow's words replayed in her head, each one cutting deeper than the last. She knew she couldn't run from what she had done, but the path to redemption seemed shrouded in darkness. The next morning, a messenger from the palace arrived in the village. He carried news that Omari was seeking answers about Abeni's disappearance, and would personally visit the village in 3 days. The announcement sent a ripple of unease through the community. For Imani, she felt she was close to confessing the evil she did in the dark. Imani spent the next 2 days in seclusion, preparing herself for what was to come. She knew Omari's visit would bring the truth closer to the surface, but she also knew that the shadow at the river was far from finished with her. The village prepared for Omari's visit with both excitement and trepidation. The streets were swept clean, and the villagers adorned their modest homes with fresh flowers. Omari's reputation as a just and discerning ruler preceded him, and his presence demanded respect. Imani, however, felt none of the anticipation that gripped the village. She stayed inside her hut, carefully considering her next move. She knew the king's questions would lead to truths she wasn't ready to face. Yet, the shadow's words from the river echoed in her mind, "You will answer for it." On the morning of his arrival, Omari entered the village flanked by guards and advisors. He wasted no time in addressing the gathered crowd. "I have come to find the truth about my wife," he announced, his voice steady. "Someone here knows what happened to her. I will not leave until I have answers." The crowd murmured, their unease palpable. Imani stayed at the back, her head lowered, praying that his attention wouldn't fall on her. But Omari's gaze seemed to pierce through the crowd, as if he could sense the one holding the key to his questions. The elders of the village gathered to speak with Omari, offering condolences and theories about Abeni's disappearance. Some blamed the river spirits, while others spoke of curses whispered in the forest. Omari listened patiently, though none of their words brought him closer to the truth. Meanwhile, Imani's isolation drew attention. Her absence from the gathering didn't go unnoticed by the villagers or the king. That evening, one of Omari's guards was sent to fetch her. When the guard knocked on her door, Imani hesitated before answering. She opened it just enough to see the stern face of the soldier. "The king requests your presence," he said. Imani's heart beat faster, but she nodded and followed him to the central square. The crowd parted as she approached, all eyes fixed on her. Omari stood at the center, his expression unreadable. "Imani," he said, his tone measured. "You were one of Abeni's closest friends. Tell me, what do you know of her disappearance?" Imani's voice faltered. "My king, I wish I had answers. She left my home that evening, and I thought she had returned to the palace." Omari's eyes narrowed. "And yet, you did not join the search. You've kept to yourself since she vanished. Why?" The weight of his question pressed down on her, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I've been grieving in my own way, my king. Abeni was like a sister to me. Her loss has been unbearable." Omari studied her for a long moment before nodding. "I see. But grief does not absolve anyone from suspicion. If you know anything, I expect you to speak." Imani nodded, her throat tight. "Of course, my king." That night, as the village settled into uneasy quiet, Imani sat by the river once more. The water reflected the crescent moon, its surface unnervingly still. She clutched the black feather in her hand, its edges worn from her constant handling. "What do you want from me?" she whispered into the darkness. The air grew colder, and the shadow appeared again, rising from the water. Its form was clearer now, more defined. It stood just at the river's edge, its gaze fixed on her. "The truth cannot stay buried," the shadow said, its voice echoing as if carried by the current. "He will find out. You must choose how this ends." Imani's grip tightened on the feather. "I can't," she said, her voice trembling. "If he knows, he will destroy me." The shadow stepped closer, its presence heavy and unyielding. "You destroyed me," it said. "And yet I am still here. You cannot escape what you've done." Before Imani could respond, the shadow dissipated, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She knew the time for evasion was running out. The following morning, Imani returned to the forest, seeking the old woman once more. When she reached the hut, the door was already ajar. The old woman sat by the fire, stirring a pot of something foul-smelling. She didn't look up as Imani entered. "You've come back," the woman said, her voice dry. "I warned you of the cost, did I not?" Imani went down on her knees. "Please, help me. The king is searching for answers. Abeni's shadow haunts me. I don't know what to do." The old woman chuckled darkly. "You think I can undo what has been done? Shadows linger for a reason, child. They demand resolution. Tell me how," Imani begged. "What must I do to end this?" The old woman turned to her eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. "You must bring the shadow back to the river. Let it confront the one who searches for her. Only then will the truth be revealed." Imani's stomach twisted. "You mean the king?" The woman nodded. "He is the key. But be warned, the truth will not set you free. It will demand a sacrifice." Imani left the forest with the old woman's words weighing heavily on her. She knew there was no escaping what lay ahead. The shadow had made its demands clear, and the king's persistence would not waver. That evening, she stood at the riverbank once more, waiting for the shadow to appear. When it did, she spoke with newfound resolve. The morning sun rose with an air of anticipation. Imani knew this day would mark a turning point, one where the truth she had buried would surface, whether she was ready or not. As the village gathered near the river, summoned by Omari's decree, an unspoken tension gripped the crowd. Omari arrived flanked by his guards, his regal presence commanding silence. He turned to Imani, who stood apart from the villagers. "You asked for this meeting," he said. "I hope, for your sake, you have something to reveal." Imani nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she stepped forward. She avoided the gazes of the villagers, all of whom watched her with suspicion and curiosity. "My king," she began, her voice steady despite her fear. "I brought you here because the answers you seek lie in this place." Omari raised an eyebrow, skepticism clear on his face. "What do you mean?" Imani took a deep breath and knelt by the riverbank. She held the black feather tightly, its edges frayed from her constant handling. "Abeni is still here," she said. "But not in the way you remember her." Gasps rippled through the crowd, but Omari silenced them with a raised hand. He stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Explain yourself." Imani hesitated, the weight of her guilt threatening to crush her. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Abeni, come forth." The river stilled, its surface unnaturally calm. A chill swept through the air as the shadow began to rise, its form more defined than ever. The villagers stepped back in fear, their murmurs turning to cries of alarm. Omari, however, stood his ground, his eyes fixed on the apparition. The shadow turned toward him, its voice resonating like an echo across the water. Omari, you have come. Omari's eyes widened. Abeni. Is it truly you? The shadow nodded, its form flickering. I have waited for this moment. I have waited for you to see the truth. Omari's voice trembled as he addressed the shadow. What happened to you? How did you come to be this way? The shadow turned toward Imani, its presence growing heavier. Ask her, it said, its tone sharp. She holds the answers you seek. All eyes fell on Imani, and her knees buckled under the weight of their stares. She clenched the feather in her hand, drawing strength from the pain of its jagged edges. It was me, she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. I am the reason Abeni is like this. A shocked silence fell over the crowd. Omari's expression darkened as he stepped toward her. What do you mean? Imani swallowed hard, her voice shaking as she spoke. I was jealous. Jealous of her happiness, her beauty, her place in your heart. I sought help from the forest, from a woman who gave me a potion. I didn't know it would. I didn't know it would turn her into this. Omari's hands clenched into fists, his eyes blazing with anger. You did this. Imani nodded, tears streaming down her face. I didn't understand the cost. I was blinded by my envy. I have lived with this guilt every day since. The shadow spoke again, its voice softer now. She speaks the truth. But her guilt cannot undo what has been done. Omari turned away, his mind reeling from the revelation. The woman he had trusted, the friend of his beloved, had been the architect of this tragedy. His heart ached with the weight of betrayal, but his love for Abeni burned stronger. Is there a way to restore her? He asked, his voice quiet but firm. The shadow hesitated before answering. There is, but the cost will be great. Omari stepped closer. What must be done? The shadow turned toward the river, its form rippling like the water. I must return to the place where this began. The one who cursed me must reverse it. But she will not do so willingly. Imani's heart sank. She knew the old woman would demand a price for undoing her magic, a price that might be too steep to bear. But she also knew she couldn't refuse. I will go, she said, her voice steady. I will face her and do whatever it takes to make this right. Omari looked at her, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. Then we will go together. This ends now. The villagers watched in silence as Omari, Imani, and a small group of guards prepared to leave for the forest. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the truth still heavy on their minds. As they entered the forest, the familiar path seemed darker, more foreboding. Imani led the way, her steps hesitant but resolute. Are you certain she will help us? Omari asked, his voice low. Imani hesitated before answering. She thrives on power. If we offer her something she wants, she might agree. Omari's jaw tightened. And if she refuses? Imani didn't respond. She knew the old woman's price would be high, but she also knew they had no other choice. The group pressed on, the forest growing denser with every step. The light from the sun faded, replaced by an eerie glow that seemed to emanate from the very ground. When the old woman's hut finally came into view, Imani felt her resolve harden. This was the moment of reckoning. The old woman stood in the doorway, her eyes gleaming with amusement. Back again, child, she said, her voice laced with mockery. And you've brought company. How delightful. Imani stepped forward, her voice firm. We need you to reverse the curse. The old woman laughed, a cold, hollow sound. And why would I do that? Omari stepped beside Imani, his presence commanding. "Because if you don't, you will answer to me." The old woman's smile faded, replaced by a calculating look. "Very well," she said. "But the cost will not be cheap. Are you prepared to pay for it?" Imani nodded, her eyes steady. "Whatever it takes." The old woman's grin returned, sharper than before. "Then let us begin. Tomorrow, I will bring him here," she said. "But if you seek vengeance, leave the others out of it. This is between us." The next day Imani and the King Omari set out into the forest to meet with the sage, the woman who helped Imani achieve her evil trap for her friend Queen Abeni. The old woman's hut seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy as she stepped back into its shadows, beckoning them inside. Omari and Imani followed, their guards remaining cautiously outside, weapons drawn. The air within was thick and stifling, the scent of strange herbs and decay filling their lungs. "You come here demanding I undo what was done," the old woman said, stirring a pot of bubbling black liquid. "But such power requires sacrifice. Are you willing to give what it takes?" Omari stepped forward, his tone resolute. "Name your price." The woman's eyes glinted as she turned to Imani. "The curse began with her. It can only be undone if she offers what she holds most dear." Imani's heart sank. "What do you mean?" The old woman smiled, cruel and knowing. "Your freedom," she said. "You must bind yourself to this forest, serving as its guardian until your final breath. Only then will the shadow be restored to its true form." Imani's breath caught. The price was higher than she could have imagined. She looked to Omari, whose expression hardened. "This is not her burden to bear alone," Omari said. "If there is another way." The old woman interrupted, her voice sharp. "There is no other way. She set this in motion. It must be her to set it right." Imani closed her eyes, her mind racing. Could she live a life bound to the forest, away from the village, from everything she knew? But as her thoughts swirled, Abeni's shadow materialized beside her. "Do not hesitate," the shadow said, its voice gentle yet firm. "You hold the power to free me. Do what must be done." With trembling hands, Imani nodded. "I will do it." The old woman wasted no time. She began preparing the ritual, gathering rare herbs and lighting candles that filled the hut with an eerie glow. Imani knelt at the center of a circle etched into the dirt floor, her heart pounding in her chest. "Place your hand over this," the woman said, holding out a jagged stone. "And speak these words: I offer myself to the forest, to mend what I have broken." Imani's voice trembled as she repeated the incantation. The stone glowed faintly beneath her hand, and she felt a sharp pain, as if her very essence were being drawn out. The air grew heavier, and the shadow began to shift, its form becoming more solid with each passing moment. Omari watched in silence, his fists clenched. He wanted to intervene, to stop the toll this ritual was taking on Imani, but he knew this was the only way to bring Abeni back. With a final burst of light, the shadow transformed. Abeni stood before them, her figure radiant and whole. She gasped, her hands touching her face, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I'm free." Omari rushed to her, pulling her into his arms. "Abeni," he whispered. "I thought I had lost you forever." But their joy was short-lived. The old woman turned to Imani, her voice cold. "The bargain is sealed. Your life now belongs to the forest." Imani stood at the edge of the forest, the weight of her decision settling over her. The villagers had gathered to bid her farewell, their expressions a mix of gratitude and sorrow. Even those who had once whispered against her now looked at her with a newfound respect. Abeni approached, her eyes glistening with tears. "You saved me," she said. I can never repay what you've done. Imani smiled faintly. You don't owe me anything. This is my path now. Omari stepped forward, his expression solemn. You have my eternal gratitude, he said. If there is ever a way to ease your burden, you need only ask. Imani nodded, though she knew she could never return. With one last glance at the village she had called home, she turned and stepped into the forest, the trees closing around her like a shroud. The days in the forest were long and quiet. Imani learned to navigate its secrets, her senses sharpening as she became one with her surroundings. The old woman had disappeared, leaving her alone to fulfill her role as guardian. Though isolated, Imani found a strange peace in her new life. She often visited the river, its waters now calm and clear. It was a reminder of the past, of the choices that had brought her here. Yet, she felt no bitterness. She had made amends, and that was enough. Back in the village, Abeni and Omari worked to rebuild what had been broken. Their love grew stronger, and their rule brought prosperity to the land. The villagers often spoke of Imani, honoring her sacrifice and ensuring her story would never be forgotten. Abeni, now with a deeper understanding of life's fragility, became a queen beloved by all. She often visited the river, leaving flowers at its edge in memory of her friend. Years passed, and the forest remained untouched by human hands, protected by its unseen guardian. Travelers spoke of a presence that watched over them, a force that kept the forest alive and thriving. One evening, as the sun set over the treetops, Abeni stood at the riverbank, her children playing nearby. She looked toward the forest, a soft smile on her lips. Though she couldn't see Imani, she felt her presence, a quiet reassurance that all was as it should be. And deep within the forest, Imani stood beneath the ancient trees, her heart steady and her spirit at peace. She had found her purpose, and in doing so, she had become more than she ever thought possible. A guardian, a protector, and a reminder that redemption could bloom even in the darkest of places. Can friends be happy when they see you shine and succeed, or when you share your good news to them you become their enemy? Please drop your thoughts and experience in the comment section. Stay tuned for more interesting stories. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe.